Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to Stately Fawn Manor, where it's my weekend reading report. That's right, Roger and I have returned to talk about all the stuff I read last week, which wasn't much, to be honest. It's been busy. Early in the week, the first couple days, I actually had some time to read, but then everything got, like it usually does in my life, and I'm stuck doing a bunch of stuff, which doesn't involve reading the most important thing. But I did get some reading done. I read some stuff. I got one kind of cool thing that arrived at the manor. So, kind of an abbreviated weekend reading report. I'm going to go on for 20 minutes anyway, because like I always do. So, what did I read this week? Okay. I think, you know what? For the 500 book challenge, I forgot to even mention the 500 book challenge last weekend reading report. I think I'm up to, I think I'm reading book 60 right now. So book 59 was this book. This is The Last Man by Mary Shelley, which I finished. This is for Roger's Cheap Old Book Club. Every month, Roger has chosen a book that's really cheap to get, free in fact, from Project Gutenberg. I have a Discord where people talk about the books that they've read. No one's reading this one. Actually, a couple people have read this one, but this is a bit slow and a little bit challenging. So, The Last Man by Mary Shelley, which is a book about exactly what it says it is. Actually, she probably should have titled it something else, because that way the end would be a surprise. Because it takes a while for the last man to become the last man. It's interesting the way this book is set up. It takes place in the far future of the 21st century, where there has been absolutely no technological progress since Mary Shelley's day, at least none that is apparent, except for the fact that people use hot air balloons to travel. That's kind of cool. Otherwise, everything is pretty much exactly the same from when Mary Shelley was alive, except that there is another difference. Britain is no longer a monarchy. It has become a democracy. And so that is interesting. And there's actually a lot of interesting things about this book. It is about a global pandemic that slowly wipes out everybody on Earth except the last man and destroys all of our cultures, and causes all kinds of mayhem before everyone dies. When I mentioned this last week, I think it was last week when I was talking about this, I mentioned it had a particularly slow start, at least it seemed that way to me. After about the first book, it does pick up in that, then the pandemic shows up, and it's kind of interesting to see how everything unfolded. This is a very grim book. It's understandable why she spent so much time in the beginning of the book with the characters, because it just adds something when they all start, dying off. That's not a spoiler. I mean, the last man. And so it's a particularly interesting book. Mostly, though, it's interesting for reasons that don't have much to do with the story. The story is kind of interesting in the way it's told. But a lot of the things that are interesting about this book have to do with Mary Shelley and where she was at this point when she was writing this. This whole book is about grief and loss. Loss, most particularly. At this point in Mary Shelley's life, she had lost a lot. Children, her husband. She didn't have the friends that she used to have. She had been through it, Mary Shelley, and that is all reflected in this book. This book is all about that, I think. And so, if you're interested in Mary Shelley, this is pretty much a must-read, I think. A pretty important book when it comes to the author. As for just a reading experience, it has some issues. I will go into that at further length when I talk about this. I'm behind in my Rogers Cheapold Book Club videos. Problem is, I'm only doing about 4 videos a week, and I have more ideas than that. It was easier when I was doing videos every day, but then, I didn't have much time to read. It's a conundrum. Anyway, interesting book. I wouldn't recommend it wholesale to everybody. Wholesale? I wouldn't recommend this book to everybody, but it is interesting. It is definitely that. So, The Last Man by Mary Shelley. I read that. Now, then I moved on to this month's big event. This month our big event is BookTube at War, where we're reading fiction all about war and nonfiction all about war. Basically, if it's a book about war, that's what we're reading this month. And the first book I'm reading for BookTube at War is Tides of War by Stephen Pressfield. So this is the guy that wrote a book called Gates of Fire, which a lot of people read. Very, very good historical novel about the ancient world, about the 300 Spartans and their last stand against the Persians during the Persian War. That was a really good book. This book is not as good as that book. This is about Alcibiades, who was a very, very interesting person in ancient Greek history, and the Peloponnesian War. It's all about that. It doesn't really work nearly as well as Gates of Fire, though. Despite having some really terrific parts, there are some scenes in this book which are just fantastic. However, it doesn't all hang together all that well. A couple issues I have with it. First of all, the main character is not particularly interesting because it's not Alcibiades. It's a soldier that was acquainted with Alcibiades. And so Alcibiades, who is the guy we want to read about, he's the interesting one. We don't spend all that much time with him. We kind of get him from a distance, and we spend a lot of time with the main character, who's a soldier, who isn't that interesting or even particularly likable. But we're stuck with him. Like I said, despite that, it does have some really engaging scenes. However, if you don't already know an awful lot about the Peloponnesian War, I imagine that this must seem a little bit disjointed and perhaps a little confusing at times. It basically has moments from some of the more memorable parts of the war, or some of the more famous parts of the war, and the place that Alcibiades fit into here. Alcibiades was a guy who was a Greek general, but then he got in trouble, and then he defected to Sparta, and then he worked for Sparta against Athens, and then he went to Persia, and then he went back to Athens. So he was all over the place. Really interesting guy. Man, wouldn't it be great if we got a historical novel all about him, and we spent a bunch of time with him, and it kind of investigated why he was doing the things that he was doing. This does a little bit of that, but not much. Like I said, you're always at a distance from this character. And so you don't learn any more about him than you do from reading Thucydides, for example, or perhaps Plutarch. If you read those, you really don't get anything more from this. And so that was a bit of a disappointment. It also feels, I don't know how long this book is because I'm reading it on Kindle. I got it 100 years ago. I don't know how many pages are in this book, because I guess I could look it up. According to this Kindle, I am 62% done, which means I'll probably finish it on the weekend. It's good, but it's not great. That's what I'm thinking. I haven't finished it yet, But it just leaves me actually... There's so many moments in that book where I wish I was just reading this again. This is the Landmark Thucydides. This is the Peloponnesian War, the Landmark edition, which has all of the cool maps and everything, which you could really use in this novel, which are in the beginning of the book. I guess if I had a paper version, it'd be easy to flip to those, but it's not so easy when you have an ebook version. But it did make me really want to read this, because there's a lot of Thucydides in this novel, Tides of War, a lot. But this actually is a much better read, is much more interesting, and you learn a lot more about the war. And it actually probably has more drama than this does, even though this does have that. Like I said, it's good, just not great, and not nearly as good as Gates of Fire. So there's that. So I've only finished one book in my 500 book challenge, the challenge where I'm reading 500 books 500 books I own before I'll buy any new ones. This was 59, and that makes Tides of War number 60. Should finish that up in a couple of days. And then I'm going to be moving on. I'm going to be, for the next thing I read, I'm going to be temporarily moving away from BookTube at War and going back to my Pulp Hero project, and I'm going to be reading this, a book of nonfiction. This is The Great Pulp Heroes by Don Hutchison. Hutchison. The Great Pulp Heroes. This looks really interesting. It's all about the Shadow and the Spider and Doc Savage and all of these characters from the Pulps, which is exactly the stuff I'm reading about. So yeah, this is the next thing I'll be reading. I look forward to that. And then back to BookTube at War with this book. This is The Killer Angels by Michael Shara. I only hear good things about this book. I hear this book is fantastic. So looking forward to reading this. So, you know, some good stuff coming up, actually. Also for BookTube at War, I am currently reading this. This is Showcase Presents Sgt Rock. DC Comics, they're a bunch of lamos, so they haven't come out with a nice omnibus edition of Sgt Rock. They don't have any current reprint volumes of Sgt Rock because they're idiots, DC's reprint program. Why don't you make a DC Comics Sgt Rock omnibus? But anyway, this is great. This is Showcase Presents Sgt Rock, so these showcase volumes are all in black and white. But Sgt Rock does happen to be probably the greatest war comic book of all time. We'll see. I'm going to read a couple more for this month. Haven't gotten far because I've just read this like one day last weekend. So I'm going to try to read a lot more this week of Sgt Rock. Fun stuff. I love this character. I used to read this character all the time when I was a kid. Perfect for BookTube at War. But I've also got the World's Finest challenge going on where I read Batman and Superman every single day of my life. Every day, Superman and Batman. I have moved on from John Byrne. I finished up John Byrne's revamp of Superman, which doesn't quite read as well nowadays as it did when I first read it as a teenager. There are moments where, like, John Byrne isn't the greatest writer in the world. Fantastic artist, though. The artwork in those issues were great. All across the board, really. Not just from John Byrne, but a lot of the art from that period is really, really good. Some of the stories are really entertaining, too. I have to give him that. But some of the choices John Byrne made. I mean, he had an issue where and I'm not making this up, Superman and Big Barda, which was a character created by Jack Kirby, Superman and Big Barda were mind-controlled by a monster, by a slimy monster, into making a porn movie. I don't know how far they got in making the porn movie, but they were. I'm not kidding. That literally happened. The 80s, man, they were a weird time for comic books and everything else. But that's taking grim and gritty to some extremes, I think. I'm not making this up either. This actually happened. Anyway, in that comic, I'm reading different things now for Superman and Batman. I am reading this. This is Adventures of Superman by Gil Kane. So this has a bunch of stories illustrated by Gil Kane. And Gil Kane is just an amazing comic book artist. He's legendary. He's a legendary comic book artist. And This just has some fantastic artwork. Just started reading this a couple days ago, but it's amazing. It's good stuff. So this is really cool, reading this right now, Adventures of Superman by Gil Kane. For Batman, I'm reading this. This is the Silver Age Omnibus Volume 1. So it's a bunch of Silver Age comics, which are tremendously entertaining, I have to say. I'm surprised how much I like this. A lot of the art is by Sheldon Moldoff, which is not an artist I particularly liked when I was younger and I saw examples of his work, but I'm really enjoying him now. This is great stuff. Now, the first story in this is this story with Batwoman, which is a very 1950s story. So get this. Batwoman shows up on the scene, okay, and starts, and Batman and Robin, they don't know who Batwoman is in the start of this story. So she shows up and starts fighting crime. And Batman and Robin are like, what? Doesn't she know that fighting crime is dangerous? We can't let a girl out there fight crime. That is just, we can't let that happen. So Batwoman is fighting crime. Now, I have to say, in this story where Batwoman first shows up, she saves Batman's life like 3 times. She's in this story where she premieres, she is way better at crime fighting than Batman is. And I think that's why Batman didn't want her to be Batwoman anymore. Because Batman, let's face it, he's a guy that drags a little kid, this little kid, into danger every issue of Batman and Detective Comics. A little kid, he just drags in front of like criminals with guns. Doesn't think anything of it. But a grown woman doing what Batman does? Oh no, we can't have that. So by the end of the story, he talks Batwoman into not being Batwoman anymore, and she's like, yeah, whatever, I'll stop being Batwoman, Batman. I'll see you in a couple of issues, which she does. Interesting, man, the 1950s. But fun, man, this book is fun. So, yeah, reading that right now. I told you this would go on for like 20 minutes. I wasn't lying. I don't lie, Roger. Hardly ever. Anyway, I did get one exciting thing here at the Manor. Comic book related, of course. But I got a lot of Aquaman. So, more Showcase Presents volumes. These old black and white volumes of comics. Got Aquaman Volume 1. Aquaman Volume 2. Look at this wonderful moment. Everybody's there for Aquaman and his wedding, I'm assuming. And Aquaman Volume 3. I've got a lot of Aquaman. Now, at one point, DC Comics did solicit a Silver Age, I think it was a Silver Age Aquaman Omnibus, which I was very excited about. I pre-ordered this Silver Age Aquaman Omnibus, and I couldn't wait for it to show up, and then they canceled it. Idiots. And they've never announced that they're going to print it, actually. So no Silver Age Aquaman Omnibus for us, comic book fans. No, all we have are these Showcase Presents volumes. So I picked them all up because it's probably the only way I'll ever get to read these Aquaman stories. Because I never have read any of these old, well, maybe a few in single issue reprints, but I've never had a collection of these old Aquaman stories. I don't think there's been one, actually, other than these, except maybe a couple of archive editions, maybe one archive edition of Aquaman. Don't remember any more than that. But, this is, over, what is this? Over 1,000 pages of Aquaman, these 3? Well over that. So, Aquaman. I'm finally going to be able to read these stories. I am not waiting for DC Comics to make a nice hardcover omnibus because, DC Comics. Anyway, I think that's everything. Did I mention everything, Roger? Okay, I think I've mentioned everything. Catch me back here tomorrow. And I think when this goes up, I think I'll double check, but I think I'm doing a live today with MJ at Reading This Life Is it going to be live? I don't even know. I'm doing something with MJ, which I think it might be alive at 9 o'clock on Reading This Life. I don't know what's going on. I'll show up there, whenever it's on though. Well, it won't be a disaster or anything. I'm sure it won't be. Anyway, guys, I will catch you next time.